Hi, my name is Mariah Patton, and today I will be reflecting on our discussion board number 2. Discussion board number 2 is really looking at the American Nations book and also reflecting that and connecting it with the social work code of ethics. So, for chapter 7, this was the founding of the South, the Deep South, and I want to review some of the information that I could take away from this. So, I personally did not see the founding of the Deep South of something that I could connect with the code of ethics, with their values and their principles. I personally saw the Deep South as just an example of maybe a community or a nation that really reflects more back on power, on wealth, rather than caring about their people. And an example of this from the book would be on page 90. It really discussed that the Southern society was militarized, case structured, and aggressively expansionist. This nation did not present justice or integrity at all, in my opinion. I feel like it really just looked at slavery, wealth, and power. So I was unable to reflect this and relate this back to the code of ethics. The next one that I would like to relate back to the Code of Ethics is Chapter 8. And Chapter 8 was about the foundings of the Midlands. This chapter was most influential to me and really connected more with the Code of Ethics than any of the chapters that I reviewed for this discussion board. So the Midlands, I believe, could relate back to several principles and several values for several examples. So one example that I would like to show would be all humans were thought to be essentially good and were to treat one another as they would wish to be treated. And this was found in the American Nations on page 93. So just reviewing this, I could really see that these people in this society and in this culture really cared about one another, and they cared about human relationships and also justice. So another example would be all were equal before God, regardless of sex, race, or gender, and all earthly authority was ultimately without legitimacy. And this was also found on page 93. So I believe that the Midlands did align with the Code of Ethics because they present as a community of people who care about one another, and they focus on their values and focus on what they care about and just really put that into the picture. Next is Chapter 9. So Chapter 9 is the founding of Greater Appalachia. Appalachia presented as a place to me where I saw a lot of liberty and honor, and I saw this as being important to them. An example of this from the American Nations is the borderlands valued individual liberty and personal power, and they were happy to take up arms to defend either of these things. So I could see in this, relating back to the Code of Ethics, just looking at integrity and competency. It was looking as if in the book that these people really cared about honesty and liberty, and that's who they were and are. And so they are willing to do whatever they can do to stay who they are and to stay competent in who they are. So I could really relate this back to some of the values and the principles in the Code of Ethics. The Appalachians looked at the values of human relationships as well and the importance of them. So, for example, intermarriages with first cousins were a commonplace and reinforcing bonds of kinship. And this was found in the American Nations on page 105. You could see that they really cared about relationships because no matter if they were family or friends, they really wanted to be with one another, and they wanted to make kinship an important thing. So I was able to find this on page 105 of the American Nations. Next is Chapter 20. So Chapter 20 is looking at the founding of the left coast. In reflecting on the left coast, I can see that this is a place where I could reflect again back onto the Code of Ethics. So I believe that the left coast really focused on the value and principles of service, and an example of this would be some donated land, money, and materials for missionaries to build churches and schoolhouses in San Francisco, Sacramento, and Monterey. And this was on American Nations on page 222. This just really shows that they cared about helping those in need, and looking at the values of integrity and just looking at, the worth of people and understanding that the missionaries were doing important work and just helping their community and their nation. Also, I have an example of how important relationships was for them. So, in the American nations, the culture that formed idealistic but individualistic was alike that of the gold digging lands in the interior, but very similar to those in the Western Oregon and Washington. And this is in the American nations, again on page 223. So, I see that the left coast was respecting others while they were involving, and I do believe that this relates back to the code of ethics, because as social workers, we are constantly evolving, and we are constantly just trying to respect others and be open-minded in who others are and what people are and what they're doing. The last chapter was chapter 22, which was the founding, the Far West. And to be honest, I could not really relate the Far West back to the Code of Ethics. This chapter really just focused on a lot of selfishness, in my opinion. It presented as if the people really did not care about one another, and it also kind of reflected back, I think, to chapter 7. Both of these places really just looked at power, wealth, and slavery, and just not really focusing on, their people and the importance of their people. So overall, I found chapter 8, the founding of the Midlands, to be the most resourceful and the one that really could relate mostly back to the Code of Ethics, because their values really represented a lot of the ones that are connected with the Code of Ethics, such as service, integrity, competency, valuing human relationships. These are all very important to look at. And overall, I hope that this information was good to hear, and thank you for listening.